Hello, 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 and welcome to Kindred Skulls. My name is Gregg Blake, and I am happy to join one of my other co-hosts this week. We've got so much to go over. We're going to talk about the Vikings defense, what to expect from a Brian Flores-led defense on a much greater level of detail than we've gone yet. Lots to go over. Matt Freese is ready to go. He's literally I see him. He's tensile. His muscles are contracted. He's ready to pounce like a Minnesota Vikings linebacker. Matt, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing great, Greg. Yeah, I've been looking forward to doing this for a long time, and it's just schedules haven't lined up.
Yeah.
So we've got this on the books. The Brian Flores defense is something I'm really pumped about coming to Minnesota. So it's something I want to talk about. But first, we got to talk about you a little bit, man. I mean, you got the flow rock in there. You got a bigger beard than I do right now.
I
Which
was gonna say.
if you're not watching the video on YouTube of this, you got to check it out. Like,
I was
Greg's
gonna
looking
say,
good
man,
over
I
there.
finally have you beat in the beard
Yeah,
category. I'm not quite there on hair length yet, but I'm
yeah.
working on it. It's
That's okay. It's a constant work in progress. You make progress every single day if you think about it. So
yeah, little bit by little bit. Speaking of progress, let's hope the Minnesota Vikings make some progress defensively.
yeah,
Uh, we obviously, right, that was a really tough year. It's been well documented. Um, so we talked about this a little bit last time we were together,
mhm.
just like some of the basics of what to expect from this defense. But for our hardcore listeners who love the deep dive, this is your pod, okay? I'm going to be mostly out of the way. Matt is going to give you all of his brilliant knowledge of what to expect, and you don't have to listen to the ramblings of the everyman this episode. I'm going to be I'm going to be stepping aside for the most part, but I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to hear. I'm excited to learn, and I hope our listeners are as well, and our viewers who are viewing
Yeah,
on YouTube.
and
Okay.
we're gonna use Greg to check me on this episode, right? Because I'm
Sure,
probably
yeah,
gonna go a little bit overboard and get a little bit too technical in some places, or lead to some questions. So we're gonna try to have him ask the questions that you might be having while you're
I'm here to
listening to this,
wrangle.
if you're not sure what's going on, and I can try to explain it the best I can.
I
But
got my lasso today. We'll wrangle you if I have to.
but yeah, are you ready to kick it off, Greg? We can
I'm
kick
ready,
it
man.
off with a bit.
Enough chit chat. Let's get into this. We got lots to go over.
Yeah,
Um, let's start at the basics. Let's start at the beginning.
yeah. So
Okay, and
kick it off
tell it.
with a bit of the Flores biography, right? Flores
Yep.
obviously started out in the Patriot system. He started as a scout. He then came up through the coaching ranks. I believe his first year as a coach overlapped with the 1 year Kevin O'Connell was there in 2008, I want to say. And then, he worked his way up until he was eventually the defensive play caller in the 2018 season, where the Patriots ended up beating the Rams in the Super Bowl. Obviously, working for the Patriots, that means he's a Bill Belichick disciple, right? Bill Belichick's defense has spread a number of ways across the NFL, although it really hasn't been all that successful because it tends to be in the head coaching side, and those guys tend to flame out. However, obviously, the Patriots have had an incredibly successful defense over the 20 plus years Belichick has been there. And Flores was kind of replicating some of that success in Miami until he got fired, right? For reasons that I think we can safely say were unrelated to the performance of his defenses, right? It was more perhaps how he dealt with Tua, or it was more perhaps ownership pushing him out, right? Depending on what side you end up there. But he
The courts will decide.
Yes, but he
The courts will
did
decide.
show, a much bigger measure of success there than, a Matt Patricia led Lions team or Eric Mangini back in the day, right? Like, there have been levels to the success, and and Flores was probably the most successful Belichick adherent. Somebody who also comes into the picture here is Nick Saban, obviously the legendary coach at Alabama, who has his own defensive style that he developed with Belichick. Saban's defense and Belichick's defense, what they run is not exactly the same, but they have the same principles, and they can pull off of what each other do, essentially. So in some of the playbooks you'll see for Belichick, you see Saban principles like rip Liz, which we'll get to a little bit later, as a way to call a defense. So Nick Saban matters here too. And of course, those are two of the best defensive minds of all time, right? So it's a pretty good tree to be plucking off of for the Vikings defense. Back to Flores, he, became the Dolphins head coach in 2019. They were tanking that year. I mean, functionally, the roster was an absolute disaster, right? So even if they weren't intentionally losing games, which the lawsuit alleges that the Dolphins owner, offered Flores money to intentionally lose games, basically. Even if they weren't intentionally losing them, they were losing them by the fact that they had such a poor roster. Once they built that roster up in 2020 and 2021, the defense got significantly better, increasing to a middle of the pack defense. So we saw that from him, and then unfortunately for Flores, he ended up getting fired. He goes to coach with the Steelers last year. He does implement some of those principles. The Steelers played a lot more man coverage in 2022 than they had in previous seasons, and I think Flores was a big influence on that change. In addition to that, you had, so after that, I guess I should say, he's obviously hired as the Vikings defensive coordinator while he still has ongoing lawsuits against multiple NFL teams, which kind of speaks to the character of who Flores is as a person, right? And who he is as a teacher and a leader and a defensive coordinator, that the teams are willing to go after this, because we've seen the NFL completely blackball players. Absolutely. Right, who have taken a stand against the NFL. And I guess the dynamics between coaching and playing is a little bit different, but it does say something that teams are actively willing to hire Flores despite this ongoing, lawsuit with the NFL.
Yeah, I think personally, on a human level, that I think I said this the last time we talked about him, that does speak volumes about his, who he potentially is as a person and certainly is as a coach. There's no requirement that he be hired back to the NFL while he has an ongoing lawsuit. That's not part of,
right.
There's no, I'm sure there's no bylaw that says you have to. So it does speak to his talents for sure.
Yeah. So if we flip it from kind of his history, right, and we look at what the history of that defense does, and we'll start with schematics, or we'll start with personnel and kind of the overarching principles of the defense, and then we'll get into schematics both on the front seven and in the secondary and coverages, right, in terms of pass rushing, run defense, and coverage. So,
and if I may, before we get too into it, our objective today, Matt, and tell me if you disagree, is to avoid draft indicators as much as possible. We're just talking past history. We'll talk about the draft soon. We've got a podcast on that, but
I'm going to talk about how personnel fits and what we might need to add to get to that, but I'm not going to say, X player in the draft fits really well.
That player. Yeah,
right. So
just so the listeners know, that's not this pod. That's the next one.
So I think the two main principles of the Belichick defense as we see it, and this is kind of coach talk, right? Because every coach talks about this, but physicality is number one. And I think that's led to be true for the Belichick defense. Particularly on the defensive line, they ask for physical players who are strong run defenders rather than finesse pass rushers generally, right? If you look at the history of New England defenders, you'll see the top guys be obviously Vince Wilfork back in the day, right, was just an absolute beast of a human being who was a monster. But Rob Ninkovich or even I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Trey Flowers, right? The guy who went to the Lions then. They put up good production in the Belichick defense by being physical power players rather than being finesse speed players. There have been finesse speed players in the past. Obviously, Chandler Jones is one of those. He had a lot of success with New England before being traded and getting a ton of sacks with the Cardinals. But he looks for physical run defense players up front first. So that physicality is important. It's also important in the secondary where he needs a strong box safety, typically players who can play in the box and actively take on blocks, and also cornerbacks who are active in run defense because oftentimes they're left to be the force player in run defense. And then the second thing he asks for is versatility. And this is very true on the New England defense, where you see body types that you don't see anywhere else. Trey Flowers is a good example of an edge rusher body type, probably somebody who was about 270, played about 280 pounds, who reduced down inside and pass rush from the inside. A lot of times. You have guys like Kyle Van Noy or Andrew Van Ginkel in Miami who are like 240-pound players who play on the edge, but also are asked to be in coverage as linebackers. You have versatile safeties like Patrick Chung, who was terrible with the Eagles, right? Or Eric Rowe, who was also terrible with the Eagles. There's some sort of weird combination between players who used to play for the Eagles and then played for the Patriots and actually did pretty well. Jalen Mills is another one of those examples. But guys who are bigger body types who they ask to play in man coverage, and they've had success putting those guys in that role, which is kind of interesting to me. So that level of versatility is important as well.
I just want to touch on that for a second because it does seem like a phenomenon of Pat's teams, Pat's rosters in particular, but obviously Flores is part of this, that it does seem like they do a tremendous job of figuring out a player's strengths and using them in creative ways rather than trying to fit them exactly into a box, which is why a
Yes.
lot of those guys seem to flame out as soon as they leave, and some of them even come back and start to have a resurgence. And it's like, okay, there must be doing something.
Yes, they do a good job of figuring out what players' specific strengths are and then using those strengths or using them for specific roles. There's a pretty good example of, I believe it was Danny Shelton, was a player for them who barely played in 2018 when they had the Super Bowl run. And then he played a ton of snaps in the playoffs, and they ran a specific front that they had designed for him to stop the Rams offense, the 6-1 tilt front, which is something, again, we'll talk about a little bit later, where, he is a fringe player who they found a specific use for against a specific opponent in the most important game, the Super Bowl, and it worked very well for them, obviously limiting the Rams to 3 points in that win, right? It was one of the most dominant defensive performances in Super Bowl history. So you see that time and time again. And then they had a very unique player in a long time in Dante Hightower, right? Who was 260 pounds as a middle linebacker who was, kind of an old school middle linebacker they also used as an edge rusher, who was just a dominant player and very smart player for them for a long, long time, who they kind of molded their defense around. So they take these unique players and they recognize that they are very rare skill sets, and then they're able to mold it to work to those players' strengths. So I do think they do a very good job of that. Just a basic thing for the Patriots in general, in terms of the personnel they like to use, or I should say the Flores defense. The Patriots are true mostly in this respect as well, but they use a fair amount of base. They use 27% base. All teams use a bunch of nickel. They use 52% nickel, but importantly, they use 21% dime. And this is the Dolphins defense in 2021 used 21% of their snaps. They had 6 defensive backs on the field. The Patriots have mirrored that a lot recently as well. And that's important to note because that's way more than most teams in the NFL play. You're going to need a lot of defensive backs in the system, which, not talking about specific players in the draft, but I think it's clear with where the Vikings are at in their defensive back room, they probably need to add talent to that location. And
You said that in the most political way possible. In my head, I was going,
yeah.
"Oh, we need lots of defensive backs." That's interesting.
Yeah. So we need corners in this draft if we don't add more through free agency, right, prior to the draft, or I guess after the draft. But, those are just the base numbers on that. And I'll talk about how each of those are used a little bit later in kind of the schematic types. But in terms of the body types that we want to have on the field, the first thing you want is defensive linemen who are capable of two-gapping. That means a true nose tackle. Like, obviously, Vince Wilfork is the peak of this. But the Vikings have a couple guys on their roster who I think can be this in Kairos Tonga and Harrison Phillips. Like, they have the strength and the body type to be able to play true nose tackles. Then they also ask for 2 stout, like 3-4 traditional 3-4 defensive ends, which is a rarity in today's NFL, but the Vikings have added players with that sort of body type through their defense last season, Jonathan Bullard, and then they added Dean Lowry, right, through free agency this year. So they do have players with that body type, and I think Phillips has some versatility where he could play in that sort of role as well. That doesn't mean that, you're going to have 300 plus pound guys on the field every snap. I just mentioned how often they go into nickel and dime personnel, but you are going to need to use that, in base downs, in heavy rundowns, that sort of thing, where they are going to be using their base 3-4 front, let's call it, right? And again, and Flores mentioned this in his open press conference, it's not a true 3-4 defense where you need pure 3-4 personnel. They play 4-3 defense too. It really depends on their opponent. They kind of meld their game plan to their opponent, but they need versatile personnel who can do both things. Going back to what I said earlier.
Before we get too much further in
Yeah, go
body
ahead.
types, I feel like that's an overarching theme that we should just point out for everybody, that
Yeah.
if you can't tackle and if you can't play, a variety of spots on the field, you're probably not going to make it on this defense. That
Yes.
kind of seems to be one of the themes so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to eh, being able to hold up against blocks on the defensive line is critical. And in the front seven. Now we're gonna talk about Brian Asamoah in a little bit, and that's maybe a question with him. But being able to hold up against
Leave.
direct blocks, we need three guys. We need to be able to put three guys who can do that every single snap on the field. Like we need to be able to put three guys on the field at the same time who can do that. I should say.
I cut you off. We were about to talk
Yeah.
a little bit more about the line.
So yeah, we'll go to the edge rushers, right? And a 3-4, technically these guys are outside linebackers, right? They'll probably be listed as outside linebackers on the website. Don't get caught up in that. They have at least one true edge rusher type on the edge. Somebody like Shaq Lawson was used in Miami as 270 pounds. He was an outside linebacker officially. He stood up in a 2-point stance sometime, but he's not really a coverage player, right? He's not somebody who's dropping back into the coverage. Now, historically, the Belichick Flores defense has had another guy who is a guy who's versatile, 240 pounds, can drop back into coverage. The Vikings don't have somebody like that on their roster right now. Andrew Van Ginkel is an example for the Dolphins in recent years. Kyle Van Noy was with both the Patriots and the Dolphins. Josh Uche is currently with the Patriots. Those are all examples of guys with that kind of body type who are edge rushers but also drop back into coverage. So the lighter defensive end to me right now is Danielle Hunter. I think there's precedent for a player with Danielle Hunter's body type in this defense because it's literally Jalen Phillips' comp is basically Danielle Hunter from an athletic standpoint. And he is somebody for a specifically targeted draft, and the Dolphins drafted him in the first round of the NFL draft just a couple years ago, right? So obviously it's not like there's no room for Danielle Hunter in this defense because I think the heavier base end, that 270-pound plus guy, is going to be your Marcus Davenport or your Zadarius Smith, right? Like Danielle Hunter doesn't have quite that size. He's more like he's not a powerful player, but he's a speed rusher first, and then he wins with counters off of the speed rush, whereas Smith and Davenport are basically pure power rushers, right? They don't particularly Davenport really doesn't have any speed rush at all to his game. So, you have a little bit of a dichotomy between the edges there.
Right.
And then behind those guys, a 3-4 defense, those are your two outside linebackers, quote unquote. And then you have two off-ball linebackers. Now, really, you probably only need one startable off-ball linebacker in this defense, just based on the way it's structured, based on how they use personnel and how much dime personnel they use. But regardless, you're going to have two players playing on the field, a lot of the time. So you're going to need two guys who are like quality startable players. The Vikings currently have Brian Asamoah and Jordan Hicks, right? I think this is one of the weaker starting groups on the team. Just based on
You doubt my guy.
that.
You doubt my guy, Matt.
But I will say, the Dolphins and the Patriots at this point, Dante Hightower was a unique player who the Patriots invested a lot in. The Dolphins invested basically nothing in off-ball linebacker. They had Landon Roberts and Duke Riley, guys who are on minimum contracts or small contracts, guys who, most people have probably never heard of, right? Who were starting for 2 full years there, right? It's not like they have some world beaters at linebacker. You need a guy who can cover better and a guy who can defend better. I think for the Vikings, your hope would be that Brian Asamoah turns into a good coverage player and is kind of that cover linebacker who can eat up a lot of space there over the middle of the field. And then Jordan Hicks is your run defender until maybe you're able to mold Brian Asamoah into being a good run defender too, because Asamoah, he doesn't have the size to be able to take on blockers one-on-one and defeat them on a regular basis, but he does have the quickness and that to get around them and shoot gaps and play fast, which is also important in a Flores defense. So I think,
He's versatile, Matt, and he
I
can tackle.
Yeah, I think he will be very usable in this defense. It's just, obviously with Hicks being the other player there, it leaves me a little bit wanting for what we've got in the linebacker room. And then
We're,
Dye and all the guys behind him don't inspire a lot of confidence in me.
we're definitely in agreement. I just really like Brian. I wanted him to
Yeah.
succeed.
Yeah,
That's really all.
absolutely. So, that off-ball linebacker role for the Flores defense, I don't think is as important, so I wouldn't invest highly in it if I were the Vikings.
Yep.
The part that is extremely important is the cornerback room. And Nick and I did a pod. Oh, go
Can
ahead.
can I pause you for a
Yeah.
second? Do you know off the top of your head the current state of our cornerback room, just so we can get
Oh,
like a
yeah, I
full?
can name pretty much every single person in it. We have
Let's
Byron
let's like
Murphy.
establish that so we know
Yeah.
where we're at here.
Yeah. All
Because
right, let's go. Let's see if I get this right. We've got Byron Murphy, right? Obviously, we signed him. Andrew Booth Jr., second round pick last year. Caleb Evans, second round pick last year. Beyond that, we have Tay Gowan, we have Kalen Barnes, and we have I'm blanking on the last one.
seen it. Seen. I don't think you mentioned.
Well, Scene's a safety, really.
Oh, right.
Yeah. It's Tay Gowan, Kalen Barnes, and somebody else. Whatever. It's
The
not
point is,
it's
there's
not that big of
one,
a deal. We've got three players who have played significant snap. We've got one player who's played significant snaps in the NFL, right?
right.
Caleb Evans played a little bit last year. Booth played a little bit last year. The other guys, like Tay Gowan, played a couple games as a special teamer, and that's it for his career. Kalen Barnes has never seen the NFL field. It's really a weak group at that position beyond Byron Murphy. Now, I have a lot of
the weakest it's been in over a decade.
Yeah.
I can't remember a Vikings team since pre-Zimmer that was this bereft of talent, like at that position. We're in trouble.
It's pretty crazy. So I love the fit of Byron Murphy in this defense. I think he's a versatile defender who can play both man and zone, but I think he's really good in man coverage. Like, he's got really fluid hips. And if you look at the way the Patriots played man defense last year, they had a bunch of guys who were like 5'10", which is Byron Murphy's height, and not all that big, but they were quick. And the Patriots had like the best defense in the NFL, when prior to the season, people were looking at that cornerback room and being like, this is one of the worst cornerback rooms in the NFL, right? They had like a 5th round pick in Jack Jones, a 3rd round pick in Marcus Jones. Like, all of these guys, I don't think Marcus Jones was really a starter, but like a veteran in Jonathan Jones. And like, there were like 5 Joneses on that team. But but all of those guys, played above expectation. And part of that's probably due to the way the Patriots coach the system, and a really good job by Belichick specifically. But we're hoping that Flores can kind of bring that over, right? And bring young guys up. I think Murphy's a great fit because he's got inside-outside versatility. Again, versatility is key. He can play slot, he can play outside. But also, he's got really sticky, like, he's really quick. He's really quick. And I think that's the number one key for being a man coverage defender, is quickness more so than length and long speed and stuff like that, which is important. The other guys have length and long speed. So hopefully we're able to mold those two into good players and then add more talent through the draft. I think we need to at least add competition there. And then the final position, if we roll it over to safety, is the Flores defense plays a bunch of middle field close or single high coverage with one deep safety, as opposed to middle field open, which is 2 deep safeties, which is what we played a ton of last year. Typically, Belichick has split the roles of his safeties. So for the longest time in New England, it's been Devin McCourty playing deep safety. He's the deep center fielder. He's always the deep center fielder, regardless of the side of the coverage he's on or what the coverage call is. And then they have a player who is the underneath, safety, the box safety per se. I think the Vikings have the personnel to do this. In, Cam Bynum, I don't think is great, but I think he can play as an acceptable deep center fielder. And then Harrison Smith, obviously at this point of his career, I think is a perfect box safety. The other player to look out for here is Lewis Cine, obviously the Vikings' 1st round pick last year. I'm really excited for him in this scheme because Javon Holland has been a great player for the Dolphins since he got there, and Flores asked him to do a ton of different things that require the type of athleticism that Cine has. And Cine was very smart at Georgia. He was asked to do a ton of different things. By the way, Kirby Smart, the head coach at Georgia, is a Nick Saban disciple, right? So I think Scene's going to be speaking a lot of the language that Flores speaks already because of the
Yep.
defensive roots that he has. So I really see a big role for him as a versatile box safety, maybe a guy who can even man cover tight ends, right? Which is something that the Flores defense asks its safeties to do. So I think there's a lot there to work with in the safety room in terms of what we have, but the corner room needs a ton of help with how much dime and how much, 4 corners or 3 corners and 3 safeties that I think the Flores defense is going to want to play.
Well, luckily we have an abundance of draft picks. Wait, what? Oh, shit.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, we do not have an abundance of draft picks, Greg. So yeah, it's like 5, right? So it's going to be really, and we're going to use 2 of them. We're going to use one of them, and then a couple future firsts to move up for Anthony Richardson. So,
Hey, baby,
no,
you're getting ahead of things, man. We're supposed to save it. That's going to be our big reveal. We both love Anthony Richardson.
I'm just trying to tease you. I'm just trying
We got
to
to cut
tease you.
that out. We got to tease it, man. Pulling back the blanket there, or the wool or whatever. All right, let's continue. Sorry, I got us a little sidetracked here. You got me thinking about AR now. Okay, let's talk a little bit. So that is, we've kind of touched on the broader, the broader ideas, versatility, tackling types, body type stuff,
and how our guys fit, right? And
and
how
how
the
our guys
guys we
currently
have
fit, right?
Yeah.
Which is, it's a little touch and go, but we definitely have some of the pieces. Let's talk a little bit more about the schematics, Matt. Why don't you give us some of the more common personnel you'll see on the field and how it's used?
Yeah, so we'll start with the defensive front, right? The front 7, which I think kind of sets the tone for what we'll see on the back end. And the way NFL defenses work, I should note, is the front and the coverage do have to be aligned in some senses. A lot of times people will say the coverage dictates the front at this point in the way defensive works. It used to be the front dictated the coverage because run defense was more important. Now with pass defense being more important, like the coverage call will be first, and then they have a menu of fronts that they can run that coverage out of. So on early downs, you'll see the Patriots, the Flores defense go into their base defense. And they run a lot of cover 1 man out of their base defense. So they have what's called a 3-4 under alignment. That alignment has a 0 technique defensive tackle, which is a nose tackle who is head up on the nose, to typically 5 techniques, which are guys that are head up on the tackles. They might be shaded into 4 eyes when it's a 0 and 2 4 eyes. That's also known as a tight front from college. We've talked about tight fronts previously. They are something that the last regime under Ed Donatel ran as well. And then you have, again, it depends on the situation. You'll have wide 9s. Sometimes you'll have 7s, and those are your 2 edge rushers in that 3-4 front. Then you have 2 linebackers behind them, your Mike and your Mac in this terminology, or it actually depends on the front what those linebackers are called. So I'm not going to get too deep into saying, this linebacker is this, because it really depends on the front what they're called. But you got 2 middle linebackers essentially, right? 2 inside linebackers off of the line of scrimmage. And that's your 3-4 under front. That's where you're going to see Harrison Phillips or Kairos Tonga in the middle. And you'll see, Phillips or Bullard or Dean Lowry at the 5 techniques, and you'll see Hunter and Zadarius Smith on the edges, right? And then you'll see Asimo and Hicks behind the line of scrimmage, and then you'll have 4 defensive backs behind that. Byron Murphy will be one of them, probably Seen and Harrison Smith maybe, or Bynum and Harrison Smith, or Bynum and Seen, depending on what we're doing, that sort of thing in terms of the 3-4 under alignment. There's also a 4-3 under that the defense runs, and that's pretty similar, but it does shuffle guys around a little bit. The 4-3 under is what the Legion of Boom Seahawks used to great effect. So if we go to that personnel, there's a 1 technique defensive tackle, which a 1 technique is a player that's shaded on the center. So whereas a 0 technique, they're looking eye to eye, the 1 technique is on one of his shoulders. Then you have a 3 technique, which a 3 technique aligns on the outside shoulder of the guard. So, for example, you'll have 1 technique that's slightly to the right of the center right? If he's to the right of the center, on the left side, you'll have, which I guess is the offense's right side, right? So it would be to the outside shoulder of the right guard. You'd have a three technique defensive tackle, and then you have typically a um a I'm sorry, you have like a five technique, which is slightly on the outside shoulder of the tackle on the side of the one technique, and you have a nine technique out wide over the or you'll have a seven technique, sorry, on the other side with the three technique side, and then the Sam linebacker. And I actually have, and if you guys want to go, I haven't mentioned this too much, but I've been writing for zone coverage. I've got a picture of this front, so maybe that's a little bit more of a companion piece. If
I
you look up,
apologize for that.
yeah, if you look
I
up
meant
the
to mention
Flores defense on zone coverage, I won't go into this detail with the rest of them just because it's a lot of detail, right? You have a seven technique on one side, and then the Sam linebacker's a nine technique on the side with the five technique.
I'll just tamp down here. I meant to mention
Yeah,
that at the top. If you love what's happening here right now, do not miss Matt's write-ups on zone coverage on this. You should be able to find them all over his Twitter feed. They are excellent, and you'll get a lot of photographs and things to kind of gifs and stuff to kind of help understand what even
yeah.
more of what he's
So
talking
so
about.
there's the versatility in the defense, right? Because the two main base fronts for the Flores defense are a 3-4 front and a 4-3 front, right? So it's like it's not a pure 3-4 defense, it's not a pure 4-3 defense. It's mixed and matched based on the opponent and the game plan and what they want to do.
I have a question for you, Matt.
Go ahead.
Um, so I think I know the answer to this. I think it has to do with gaps in the offensive
Sure.
line, how they're numbered. But when you say seven technique, nine technique, you know, three technique, I've heard many times. Does that refer to the gap that they are covering, or is it a
Yeah.
specific type of player?
So it refers to the where the player lines up in relation to the opponents. So
Okay.
it goes from outside in. Um, Heads up on the center is a zero technique. To either shoulder of the center is a one technique. To the in and there's a difference between the shoulder of the center and the inside shoulder of the guard. So heads up on a guard is a two technique. You don't see that used all that often. A two eye, the eye meaning inside, is shaded slightly to the inside. So the difference between where a one technique and a two eye technique lines up, they're still in the same gap, but the one technique is closer to the center and the two eye is closer to the guard. Three
Very tech.
technique is outside the guard. Four technique is heads up on the tackle. That's your base 3-4 front. I misspoke earlier. Four eye is on the inside of the tackle. Five is on the outside shoulder of the tackle. Six is over the tight end. Um, and seven is actually over the inside shoulder of the tight end. That's where it gets a little bit weird. So a seven technique is outside of the tackle, but it's wider outside of the tackle than a five technique. And then a nine technique is all the way out wide beyond the tight end.
Does that nine technique, you know that like ultra wide formation the Eagles were using a
Yes,
few
Jim
back?
Schwartz. Jim Schwartz is those are wide nines. Those are nine
Okay.
technique defensive ends.
Right. Okay, cool. So hopefully that was a little helps the listener and follow us a
Yeah,
little bit
and
more on.
and in the article, if you just Google defensive line techniques, there's an old diagram. I think it was from a PFF article that has a pictogram of where all these alignments are. That's also included in my article to kind of give you an explanation of where those techniques are. But that's a good
Awesome.
point. And then there's another base front that the Patriots ran, and it crushed the wide zone run game. Right, it's gotten some recognition. If you remember the Browns game, in 2021, we got crushed by them running a 6-1 tilt as well. I believe we lost that game like 14-7 or something like that.
Mm.
And the 6-1 tilt is where you have 6 players on the line of scrimmage. Every one basically is responsible to cover up an offensive lineman, and it hurts wide zone because the principles of the wide zone scheme are to get a double team on a player and work up to the linebacker and create a hole by doing that the running back can choose. Well, when you have 5 offensive linemen and a tight end and they have to block 1-for-1, you can't get any double teams up to the second level of the linebacker, and the linebacker can kind of just roam free and make the play. So that's what the 6-1 tilt is. In essence for, and it's very useful in today's NFL, right? Because we have a lot of wide zone schemes. So that's just another one that I wanted to mention that's in the toolbox. And then we get to sub packages. They run some kind of standard, I guess it'd be 2-4, but 4-2, where you have 4 guys on the line of scrimmage, 2 in the backfield. They'll run some standard 3-3-5 principle stuff. But really where it gets interesting is the blitz packages for Flores, right? Because Flores is an extremely heavy blitzer. He blitzed on 38% of the plays in 2021. That was by far, maybe not by far, the Ravens blitzed a ton too, but that was number 1 in the NFL, right, that season. And that's, against a Wink Martindale defense that also blitzes like a ton. So, he blitzes a lot, and that's where I think the sub packages get really interesting. One of the sub packages, and there's a great video. If you go to my article, I kind of have a hub piece, and it links a bunch of different resources. Coach Vass, I believe he's at Coach Vass on Twitter. He is a fantastic resource for learning about defense. He's where I learn a ton of the defensive stuff that I have learned. He just really does a good job explaining it. And he's a coach, right? He knows this stuff inside and out. He's big on the Belichick defense and he's big on the Fangio defense. So he helped me both last year with Donatel. His, material helped me both last year with Donatel and this year with the Flores defense. But he has a good series of videos on that, 2018 playoff run where they ran a front called Odd Max Zero, or in an old Texans Romeo Crennel playbook it's called Sub Odd. And what that is you have 3 defensive linemen, typically a defensive tackle, like a 300-pound defensive tackle. In the video, it was Adam Butler, who's more of a stout player, right? So this could be a Harrison Phillips or a Kairos Tonga or somebody like that. Or it could be somebody with a little bit more pass rush use, depending on the situation. You have both of your defensive ends. So in our case, Zadarius Hunter, Daniil Smith, or Jesus, I got that backward. Zadarius Smith, Daniil Hunter. And then you have linebackers coming off there too. So you have, and then you have 1 linebacker behind it. So you've got 5 on the line and 1 behind. And what this does is having 5 guys on the line of scrimmage who are legitimate pass rush threats forces the offense to call what's known as a 5-0 protection. 5-0 is a man protection as opposed to a slide protection. So a slide protection, the offensive line, 3 or 4 of them will move to one side, and then the other players on the backside have their guys one-on-one. You're typically blocking 2 players with 3 guys, and then 2 players one-on-one on the backside. 5-0 is basically everybody is responsible for blocking the man in front of them. What that does, right, when the opposing left tackle is responsible for blocking the defensive end on the outside, you can run a stunt because that twist mixes up the linemen, right? They either have to be really on point with passing things off in what is supposed to be a man protection, or they have to move past each other when you run a stunt, right? And that becomes really difficult for the offensive line to pick up. So the Flores defense loves running stunts off of this type of alignment, and it's been really effective for them. They can run stunts basically in any order. It's pretty impressive. You can have a tackle end stunt where you have a 3 technique and the 5 technique switch spots. Those are called a me or a U stunt. Me is the defensive end going first and crashing into the guard while the 3 technique loops around. U is the defensive tackle crashing into the tackle while the defensive end loops around and goes and attacks the guard. The hope there is that the guard chases the guy who crashes, right? And the defensive end has a free run up the middle because the guard was in man protection on the guy who's running away from him, basically. There's a ton of combinations they can do with this. I list most of them in my article. They love doing this. You can have 3-man stunts where guys are passing multiple gaps. It's a really critical part of the way the defense generates pressure there. The other thing that's cool about it is they can call the same play and have a different alignment presented to the offense. So in some instances, they'll have a linebacker lined up as zero technique over the center, but sometimes it'll be a nose tackle, right? So there's a ton of defensive variations for this odd max zero front. The main one is you have a zero technique defensive tackle, linebackers at 3 technique, and defensive ends at 5 technique or wide 9 or something like that. But there's a rush even front where you put a linebacker at 0 technique, you put both of the defensive ends at 3 technique, you put a nose all the way out to the end of the formation, right? So there's load, there's Joker, there's Diamond Mac, there's Diamond Money. There's a ton of these different fronts that are available to the Flores defense, and it changes the picture of the offense without changing the call for the defense. So you call the stunts by position. It's the 5 technique does this and the 3 technique does this. It doesn't matter if the 5 technique is Danielle Hunter or Jonathan Bullard or Brian Asamoah, right? It doesn't matter who that is. It's they have a specific role. So you can give the same call just with a different front, but it's a different presentation to the offense. So they have to consider the threats differently, right? Because I'm going to block Danielle Hunter before I block Brian Asamoah, right? As an offensive player, I'm much more afraid of Danielle Hunter as a pass rusher than I am of Kairos Tonga, right? So it changes the focus of where the offensive line needs to focus while keeping it simple for the defense to call and execute if they all understand their different roles. So that's really the key with that. There's another defensive front that should be... Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it sounds like communication is a huge part of this as well, which means you've got to have veteran leadership, which makes me wonder if that's one of the main reasons we've kept some of the guys that I thought maybe we wouldn't keep, like Harry, this offseason. Like the idea of just filling this defense up with youth, which is what I want, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
like that could present issues if you don't have somebody who understands football and understands the NFL level and is able to communicate with a bunch of young
absolutely. Communication is key, particularly in the secondary. So the safeties are responsible for the calls in the secondary. So I do think you want to have veteran leadership. I also think that Harrison Smith in particular will be used a lot better. And that, the Vikings did move on from a bunch of players, but you need to keep at least some of those, right, to maintain a competitive team. Right. And they clearly want to maintain the competitive rebuild that Kwesi keeps talking about. They clearly want to maintain that as opposed to trying to get rid of everybody and tank or whatever.
We've been on for 4 years now.
Yeah,
competitive rebuild.
So
endless competitive rebuild.
The next front that the Flores defense uses, that everybody who's listening to this podcast, who's been watching the Minnesota Vikings for years, should be familiar with, is what they call Charger. That's their double A gap mug.
Double A, baby! So the return of the double A!
So we're bringing the double A gap mug back. Just a basic overview for those who aren't aware. You're basically your 4 down front. In the double A gap mug, it's a pass rush front, so you have 2-3 techniques, you have 2 edge rushers outside, and then you bring 2 linebackers up to the middle of the field. A lot of times it'll actually be a dime package, and they'll use a safety in the middle in the Flores system. That's not something the Vikings did. They would put both Barr and Kendricks in there under Zimmer and have Harrison Smith off the edge if necessary. We'll get to loading up the line of scrimmage more than that. But
I missed those were fun days.
Yeah, on third downs under Zimmerman, it was the most exciting thing you could have on defense, just seeing what was going to happen. But the goal of the system is to get the center to commit wrong, and then you rush the other player. So at its base, you have the 2 linebackers lined up against the center, and the center has to choose to block one of them, right? He can't block both of them. So typically what the offense will do, because they're linebackers, they're smaller players, you're not as concerned about them as you are defensive linemen. They'll have the guards and tackles block the 4 defensive linemen, the center's responsible for one of those guys, and the back's responsible for the other. So your hope is to get a linebacker on a back, right, in pass rush, and then you can get somebody home there quickly. There's a bunch of different games. It's not as diverse as the Zimmer defense, but there are other blitz schemes we'll also talk about as the Zimmer defense was. It's not as diverse, but it is still, it's got those same principles. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong here, but part of that, the double A that's also genius is that at any moment, both of those players can dump out
yes,
back in, and if the quarterback reads it wrong, he might throw right into their hands.
Yes. So the basic blitz, and sometimes it's just a bluff, right? And both of those guys back out, and they're both in zones over the middle in coverage. But the basic blitz is both linebackers take a step forward, and they read the way the center turns. And whichever way the center turns, the linebacker he turns to drops back. So if the center turns to his right, the linebacker that side will drop back and he'll have a hook zone in coverage. The other linebacker will keep rushing. So that makes, because you're reading, that makes the center always wrong. And if the quarterback tries to throw hot, and this is another topic we'll talk about when we get to the next blitz, which is even more interesting, I think. If he tries to throw hot quick underneath, you might have a guy dropping right back into that spot, which is very important. So right. That's kind of how the double A gap blitz works. I mean, we've seen it for a lot. We've seen it a ton. It's, pretty common in Vikings lore right now. I think that's enough on that. The next blitz that's really exciting for Flores, and almost probably more entertaining than Mike Zimmer, because there's so much, like, it's basically guaranteed to be an explosive play, either for the offense or the defense, is his Bengal front, which is a pure zero blitz front. So in Charger, in the double A gap look, there's a deep safety. There's a single deep safety behind that typically. In Bengal, it's a cover zero look. You have on the outside one defensive back for every receiver that's out there, right? And they're aligned typically 5 to 8 yards off of them. They're looking at the quarterback. And that's an important part. We'll get to it when we talk to cover zero, how they cover this. But everybody else is on the line of scrimmage. So that's up to like 8 guys or 9 guys on the line of scrimmage blitzing the quarterback. You, in this front, you will always have one more defender than you have possible pass protector. Every single time you're guaranteed to have a free rusher. So the offense understands this, right? So their first response is to try to go quick game, throw something hot, throw something quick. But also, when they're blocking this up, they leave the guy at the furthest edge of the line of scrimmage, as far away from the quarterback as possible, open, and the quarterback's responsible for that guy. So a lot of times what they'll do is they'll slide all 5 guys on the offensive line one direction, or all 6 guys if there's a tight end, right, one direction, have the back pick up a guy on the backside, and then let a guy come around, all the way around the back as the free rusher towards the quarterback. The reason Bengal is interesting, and this is called a tag pressure by Cody Alexander. I don't know what the Flores defense calls it, but it's very similar to the center turning in that Charger pressure, where the 3 technique and the 5 technique to the side the offensive line slides to will drop back out into coverage. So they'll take a step forward, they'll tag their guy, right? They'll get a hand on their blocker, and then they'll drop out into coverage, hoping to cover the hot zones underneath, right? Because when you're in off coverage, the danger is in breaking routes. And in this cover zero, they play off coverage, which is different from a lot of cover zeros in the NFL, where they play pure press man coverage. And what the off coverage allows them to do is solve a lot of the problems that press man represents. If you have like a pick play, right, where a slant flat play where you try to have a collision, these corners have their eyes on the quarterback because they know the ball has to be out in a certain amount of time, because they know there's a free rusher. Dolphins had a ton of success with this. The most famous one was the 2021 game against the Ravens, where they ran this blitz like 40 something times in the game. It was absurd. They ran it for more than half of the plays in the game, and they shut the Ravens offense down, right? And that was against Lamar Jackson, one of the most escapable players in the NFL. Now, if you watch the game, like Lamar plays pretty well, and he gets absolutely no help from his receivers. It's pretty pathetic the way the offense worked in that game. But it's a really impressive answer to the defense, and it puts the pressure on the offense to be constantly making plays. And that's what I like about it in terms of that. So that's something that I'm excited about seeing in this defense. On top of that, there's a front that the Patriots and Flores use, which is what's known as an amoeba front. They call it Viking, right? The amoeba front is when you have a bunch of guys off the line of scrimmage at the snap. They're all standing up. They're all roaming around. And then finally at the snap, they line up and they go at the passer. A lot of times...
A roving Viking party.
Yeah, so we've got a roving Viking party at the snap. That's going to be a lot of fun to see. From a technical perspective, it often turns out a lot like the odd max zero stuff. The 5-1 stuff where you've got five guys rushing. They're just moving around pre-snap. It's a different way to present it. It's harder for the offense to call a good protection. And then you run a bunch of stunts off of it, and it creates even more confusion, and you're hoping to get a free rusher. Now,
meant to be in heaven right there.
Yeah. So I will say the one negative thing with stunts before I move on, and I don't want to present this as like a perfect defense, right? All of these defenses have limitations, and I think that's something we didn't go too much into with the Fangio defense under Donatel last year, where it didn't end up working, right? Because they just played too passively, and the guys weren't able to execute the assignments that they were being able to ask. One of the issues with this blitzing is if you don't get home, you're very light in coverage, right? And you're going to have players that come open eventually. And with the stunts, it takes longer for guys to get home, right? When you're running straight at the quarterback against a offensive lineman, one-on-one, you're going to be able to get home quicker than you are trying to run around multiple gaps and run through multiple gaps. So, you do need the coverage to hold a little bit for this stuff to work, which will be important for the Vikings, and it's why they probably need to add more corner competition.
I was just going to say, we just talked about, the issues that we're having in that room, and it's like, here we are going the complete other direction from what we ran last year.
Yeah.
And we were having trouble covering people last year with more players. So it's definitely... It makes it pretty clear, I think, we're not walking out of this draft without at least a couple of corners. But
yeah, and one last thing on the fronts I want to get to, and I haven't talked a ton about it, is the way the Flores defense defends the run. So a lot of this stuff that I've just been talking about has a ton of guys near the line of scrimmage. They one gap that stuff, right? So everybody's in a gap. They one gap that. In the base defense, there's more versatility. They will ask guys to two gap to take on a blocker head on and control both sides of that gap. There's also some of what the Vikings did last year, which is gap and a half. That's permeated throughout the college version of the scheme with Saban and Kirby Smart, more so than it has the Belichick version of the scheme. But I do believe Flores will do some of that, where he's asking guys to lock, peek, shed to the other direction to watch guys and gap and a half it. I think the Vikings are going to want to try to keep a player like Brian Asamoah, who I don't think has the size or strength at this point to take on, guards one-on-one as they climb to the second level. They're going to want guys to two gap to keep him clean and keep him as a free rusher, or they're going to ask him to shoot gaps as a one gap defender, in the more aggressive blitzes of the defense. So I think we're going to see a variety of types of run defense from this team, but we will see both pure two gap principles, which is pretty rare in the NFL, and one gap principles when we're in blitz looks. So I think base looks is more the two gap stuff, and blitz looks is more the one gap stuff. As an overarching point on that.
So to reiterate, we've talked about fronts. We've talked about the different packages we'll run with those fronts, different sub packages. It's blitzing. Yeah. But as you said, this is a passing league, Matt. It's a passing league. So tell us a little bit about what type of coverage we're going to run with our non-existent corners.
Yes. So the Belichick defensive tree has every coverage imaginable available to it. Like everything is in the playbook. However, there are clear preferences, right? And first of all, they prefer middle of field close coverages. That's single high. That's going to be your cover 1 and your cover 3 coverages, to middle of field open, which is like cover 2, cover 4 quarters, that sort of thing. In 2021, the Dolphins ran 66% middle of field close. That was first in the NFL. They ran 25% middle of field open. I think the other percentage was like red zone looks and stuff like that, where you don't have a true definition. And that was 31st in the NFL, right? So first in middle of field close, second to last in middle of field open. Like that's a pretty clear preference, right? And then in terms of cover 1, cover 1 is what we call man coverage. It's just man coverage across the board with a single high safety and a rat or a robber in the hole. The Patriots ran an astounding 58% man coverage in 2018. That's the highest number in like recent history. Basically, like that's a ton of man coverage, and they had a phenomenal defense that year, right? Stephon Gilmore might have won Defensive Player of the Year, or he deserved it and then won it the next year when he didn't really deserve it as much. You know how that goes. But and then the Dolphins were top 5 in man coverage in both 2020 and 2021. Obviously, part of that top 5 is competing with the Patriots, who run a ton of it, right? Who are also in the top 5. So it's very clear that this defense has a preference for that.
And if I can ask you a question, Matt, I remember that defense pretty well, because I remember it was the first time I ever really understood what cover 1 meant.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the aspects of it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that it allows you also to free up your linebacker or linebackers to kind of do all those versatile things. You know, you can have them lining up on the line of scrimmage. You can have them dumping coverage. You can have them going to the cover the outside.
I mean, the number one thing is that it allows you to blitz. So when you're rushing 4 players, you've got a rat in the hole. You've got man coverage across the board, right? So you've got let's say it is a spread offense, and the running back is next. You've got 11 personnel, 2 wide receivers, a wide receiver and a tight end, and then a running back in the backfield. And the back is going to release out into the route, right? So you've got corners on the outside, you've got a slot corner on the wide receiver, you've got a safety that's come down into the box who's covering the tight end, you've got a linebacker who's in man coverage on the running back, right? And this is standard nickel personnel, right? So then you have a deep safety, which in the Patriots defense was Devin McCourty, right? Back in the day it was Patrick Chung. I don't know who it is at this point. Maybe Kyle Duggar, somebody like that, who's in man coverage on the tight end. And then one of your 2 linebackers is in man coverage on the running back. The other linebacker is the hole player. So the hole player has a zone over the middle of the field, and they're very important. Now, there are 2 ways to play it. There's rat and robber. And I think the Patriots have slightly different terms, but rat and robber are the general terms that people use. Rat is a linebacker who has that whole coverage in the middle of the field. Robber is a safety who comes down. So in some defenses, there will be a linebacker in man coverage on the tight end, and the safety will come down and be the whole player. So the difference between rat and robber is the body type that's playing the whole player, right? It's either a safety coming down from deep, or it's a linebacker in the middle of the field. But that rat and robber are very important in cover 1, because the most difficult man coverage you can ask a player to make is on routes that are over the middle of the field, right? On routes that cross the middle of the field, it's really difficult for defenders to cover that. So the rat's job is to help on those routes. So let's say you have a slot running an over route on a staple air raid play called Y cross, right? Or that, and Y often indicates tight end, but it doesn't really matter. It's a slot player running a deep 6 over route. Or think about Justin Jefferson, on those play action over routes where he's going wide across the field, right? If you have a corner in man coverage, it's very difficult to cover that, and he's going to be able to run away from that corner. But what the hole player allows you to do is the hole player is looking to both sides of him, looking for guys coming across the field. So as soon as he sees a guy break towards him, the corner calls cut is the name of the call, which indicates that the player's coming across the field and the linebacker or the hole player should pick him up. So the hole player picks him up, runs with him across the field, and then the player who made the cut call is the new hole player. So if there's a second one coming later, coming from the other side of the field, that player gets his head around on the swivel, covers the guy coming on the field, and now there's a third guy who's in the middle, right? Is the slot corner. So it gives you leverage against those plays in ways you wouldn't really have because the player's running towards that guy, right? He's running into his coverage as opposed to running away from his coverage on man coverage. And that's the critical piece for the rat and the robber there. But it also allows you to just straight up blitz that last player. And a lot of times, offenses won't send all five guys out in the route. They'll keep the running back in pass protection, right? Or to help chip against a defensive end. So in that case, you can have the player who's supposed to be in man coverage on the running back do what's called a green dog blitz, where he sees that the player is in pass protection and he blitzes the quarterback instead. So that gets you 5 pass rushers and helps you attack the coverage a little bit. Or helps you attack the pass protection a little bit. And while still remaining sound on the back end, because you're not sending the whole player on a blitz, you're sending a player who is supposed to be in man coverage when his guy, stayed in. But you can also just straight up have it designed so you blitz that 5 players. So you have 5 players on the line of scrimmage and they all blitz and then you're good to go. And a lot of times, like in that 5-1 front, that odd max 0 front I was talking about earlier, there will be instructions for one of those 5 players on the line of scrimmage. You're gonna blitz, but if the running back falls out and goes into a check down route, you're supposed to peel and get them. So you can still play that linebacker who's off the line of scrimmage can still play as the whole player in that defense. So there's a lot of variations on it, but it's the number one coverage that they like to run. And then on the outside, it's important for the corners to be good in press coverage. They give corners options of whether or not they want to play in press coverage or off man coverage, but a lot of times the Patriots prefer to add corners who like playing in press because it's the best way to play cover one. When you're impressed, if you're a good press player, you can deny a number of routes that the offense is able to run at the line of scrimmage simply by jamming the receiver and preventing him from going inside, right? If you force the receiver to make an outside release by jamming him and being physical enough and preventing him from doing that, that limits the number of options the offense has on a play. And that's why press is important. So that's what they prefer in the corners. I do think the Vikings and Caleb Evans and Andrew Booth have personnel that have the skill set to be able to do that. Now, they both need to stay healthy and on the field first. And then second of all, they need to actually be good, which is still undetermined. But it is something that, we at least have hope of them seeing. I mean, I would imagine, there's a number of guys who have that skill set in the draft. So hopefully we add somebody like that as well. There's another type of coverage that's unique to it's not unique to the Patriots. Everybody does it. But the Patriots are the first ones, and Belichick's kind of the first one to come up with it, called cover one double. And one double, and it's cover one double jersey number. So this is literally just a double team on the opponent's best receiver. And historically, what the Patriots have done is put their second best corner and another player like a safety on their opponent's best receiver, and then use their best corner to lock down the opponent's wide receiver too in man coverage, right? So there's a famous NFL Films clip of when Chad Ochocinco was on the Bengals of Belichick before the game going up to him and being like, "Hey, we're playing 1-85 all game. Good luck." And they ended up shutting down Ochocinco by playing that coverage where, it's hard because you've got one guy on the outside of you and one guy on the inside. And that's a really difficult thing to do as a receiver, even if you're as good as Chad Ochocinco was, right? It's just hard to defeat when you've got it's a 2-on-1 as a defense. We saw teams employ this against Justin Jefferson. I don't think it was the 4th and 18, but one of the catches Jefferson had against the Bills was against a 1-double coverage. He had 2 players literally on them, and he split them and outran them and made a catch, and it was phenomenal. So it's beatable if you have, I don't know, the best receiver in the NFL. Right, which fortunately he's on our team. So So, but it's a fun coverage, and it's one that they were able to pull out against good receivers. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, if we move on from that, the next coverage, which is a pure man coverage, is cover zero. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, where in cover zero, you know, traditionally, I guess cover zero was a kind of suicide blitz, right? Where you are playing all three guys on in press coverage on their receiver, and they just have to beat the receiver one on one. If the receiver wins one on one, which there are very many guys who are capable of instantly beating press coverage one on one in the NFL. Right, it's not just Justin Jefferson, but he's one of those guys who can just win one on one, and you can throw him a ball all day against a corner, and he's probably going to win it most of the time. The reason cover zero works in this instance is that the corners are actually playing off coverage, and that's the technique. They typically run this, on third down, so the corners are playing at the sticks typically. Right. So that's maybe about 8 yards, 5 to 10 yards mostly, but typically at the sticks. And they're aligned out with outside leverage on the defenders. By the way, the difference between in cover one, a lot of times your outside corners will be playing what's called inside leverage. So they're on the inside shoulder of the receiver. The idea there is to funnel the routes to the outside to make it more difficult. In this case, they're playing with outside leverage, so they're trying to funnel stuff inside, and they're looking at the quarterback rather than the receiver in front of them. So the goal is, because I talked about how quickly the cover zero blitz is supposed to get there, right? There's going to be an unblocked defender, so the quarterback has to get the ball out. The goal is to read the quarterback's intentions and say, hey, okay, we know this ball has to come out quick, so we're just going to look at the quarterback, see what he does, and then we're going to be able to rally and tackle to anything quick underneath, because there are 3 or 4 of us looking at the ball, and we're going to be able to run and tackle that player. It's really effective against screens for that reason, right? Which screens are a pretty common way to go against blitz zero or a zero blitz, where, okay, we're just going to have one of our 2 receivers block the guy who's supposed to be covering this guy man to man, and hopefully the other corner who's to that side isn't able to catch up in time and make the tackle, and we've got a big play out of it. Well, when everybody's looking at the quarterback and everybody sees the ball going that way, it's a lot easier to rally and tackle that. It's easier to rally against underneath stuff, as I mentioned, particularly because you have help dropping back, like I mentioned before with the tag pressure. You've got guys dropping back into underneath the zones, so quick slants and that sort of thing, which are going to defeat a player in outside leverage, right? If you're 8 yards off the ball and outside the wide receiver, if the wide receiver takes 1 step forward and angles inside, he's going to have an advantage against you, right? The goal is to allow the catch, but make the tackle before the first down happens with the way that you're watching. So with all that being said, there are some vulnerabilities there as well. And going back to cover one, look, if you don't have guys who can cover guys man to man, you can't run cover one all that effectively. If your guy one on one is going to allow somebody to get open consistently, that's not a great strategy for you. So we're hoping that the Vikings are able to put that together. Similar with cover zero, if they do find a way to pick those blitzes up, if they find a way to extend the time, it can lead to some deep shots being run against it, because typically the corners aren't trying to defend against deep shots. They're expecting short coverages. But the hope is that they're playing far off enough that it deters the offense from running a deep shot, and they will backpedal if there's time where the quarterback is taking more time. So there is some deterrent to the deep shots, but it is definitely like a weakness. I don't know if you remember, the Raiders played the Dolphins in 2021, and it was like a late afternoon game or something, but it was coming down to the wire, and the Dolphins ran a cover zero blitz at the end of the game, and they let up like a big 30-40 yard play to allow a game-winning field goal.
I do remember that. I totally remember that.
Yeah. So that is definitely a downside to that type of coverage, right? You are playing a risk, but
I feel like, Matt, if we're in week 5 next year,
yeah,
and we're doing a pod and we're we're struggling and it's what's going on? I feel like this moment right here, this is the one we're gonna have to circle, for a clip or something to play, and just look, I told you guys, if we weren't able to cover people one-on-one, it was going to be a problem. That's it. It does. But
So the idea for cover zero is to play safe. Flores will probably tell you that we're trying to be safe and we're playing this safe. It's not 100% safe, but it's better than just saying, all right, we need to win one-on-one every time, right? It gives guys tools to be able to win in a situation that's very difficult for them to win in.
and
Um,
if I could just say, I would rather have a defense that plays aggressively than ever watch what we just watched ever
yeah.
again,
Yeah,
ever.
absolutely. I mean, I think we're probably a little bit burned by what we just had to sit through for an entire season, but what we allowed Daniel Jones to do against us in the playoff game is just absolutely inexcusable, and I'd much rather go down swinging than see that.
Absolutely.
Uh,
I would much rather watch an aggressive defense than a pussyfooting defense, for sure.
yeah. So the last man coverage that the Flores defense will run is what's known as cover five. In their terminology, it's two man. Two man's become very popular recently in terms of trying to defend some of the high powered offenses in the NFL, like the Chiefs and the Bengals, because it's a very safe coverage. You have two deep zone defenders who help with vertical routes, and you're playing guys underneath. So, like, you can kind of high low guys if they go deep or run smashes or something like that, where it gives you some versatility. But the one thing I wanted to talk about here is how the Flores defense deals with bunch formations, which is another popular thing in offenses, right? So a bunch formation is you have one player at point, and then you've got two wide receivers, kind of flanking him to either side, right? That's something you see very often if you're watching the NFL, right? Like, so there's a couple ways to deal with it. Saban prefers to what's called play box to it, and this is what Donatel did too, where you have a corner to the outside, a linebacker to the inside, typically another slot corner, and then a safety deep. The corner to the outside has the first route that breaks outside. The linebacker to the inside has the first route that breaks inside. The corner is supposed to carry the middle, the slot corner is supposed to carry the middle route to the safety who's over the top of it. And they kind of work vertical there. The Flores defense prefers to do what's called lock and level to bunches. So it's saying we are going to play pure man coverage and we're going to follow these guys everywhere they go on the field. And the reason, like, bunches were designed to beat pure man coverage, right? Because you've got guys who are able to quickly cross each other, and that leads to the defenders running into each other. That's where lock and level comes in, because it tells the corners to play at different depths. So you'll have one guy directly on his defender. You'll have one guy, usually the inside guy, who's pretty, who's like a couple yards back. And then you'll have the outside guy, maybe 8 yards off, playing a version of off-man coverage. And they are all watching the guys in front of them and following their breaks. So it's kind of like playing off-man versus slants if you're an outside corner, because a lot of times that outside guy is going to break inside. It's playing press man against a slot fade from the point man on the bunch. And then, somebody inside might have to go outside. But the different depths allow the corners to cross each other without running into each other, which is important. So that's just why I wanted to bring up lock and level. Otherwise, two man is just man coverage, where instead of a rat in the hole, you have a second deep player. And it's been pretty effective against offensives that like to attack vertically. And the best offenses in the NFL right now love to attack vertically, in the Chiefs, the Bengals, and the Bills. Right. So two man's been effective in terms of stymieing those quarterbacks, because they can't just hit one-on-one shots to the outside to T. Higgins and Jamar Chase all day, right? They've actually got a safety over the top. So with that being said, do you have anything other questions on man before we move over to the zone coverages, Greg?
I think I kind of followed you there.
Okay, great.
It's sort of like a Tampa 2, but with man coverage instead of
Yeah,
zone.
it's the level of safety of a Tampa 2, but not exploitable as a spot drop zone is, right? Where there are holes in it where you can obviously hit. You have players following their opponents fully throughout the route.
Right.
So I mentioned earlier that the Flores defense primarily plays middle of the field close. Cover 1 is the middle of the field closed man coverage. Cover 3 is middle of the field closed zone coverage, right? So Cover three at its root, Saban calls basic cover three, like the Madden play art cover three, right? If you Most people have probably played Madden, right? You can run cover three on defense. Those are the zones that the players are supposed to go to in cover three.
Just so everyone's aware, Matt is a cheeser. Okay,
Uh,
I'm just gonna let you know right now.
well, if you give me a running quarterback, why wouldn't I be? But uh, if you've played Madden before, also you know that zone coverages are annoying because your guys don't cover the guys that they're supposed to be covering, right? So what Saban did, and this started when he and Belichick were at the Browns, they created man match coverages. So what those are is you have rules for where you're supposed to be, and the areas you're covering are generally matching to what they call country cover three, which is the spot drop zone, but you're actually covering the receiver throughout the route, from the beginning of the route to the end of the route. Saban calls cover three man match coverages Rip and Liz. Rip is to the right side, Liz is to the left side. So, as a general overview of man match, we've seen this before. Zimmer did this with man match cover seven, which is the quarters version of it. We'll get to that in a little bit. But depending on how the offensive lines, you might have the outside corners play either man on demand or man everywhere he goes. So Meg or Mod. I say man on demand. I said man on demand. It's actually man outside and deep. So if you have a player running a vertical route past 10 yards, you now have him in man coverage for the rest of the route. And if it's outside, if he runs a slant inside or an underneath route inside, you push that off to a defender inside in mod coverage. In Meg, you follow him all across the formation. Meg is typically for the backside of a coverage where there aren't other defenders in the area, and it's typically called towards your best corner, right? Your best corner, you want him in man coverage on a offensive player. You think he's going to erase anything that offensive player is going to be able to do. Where it gets interesting is when you get towards the middle of the field, right, and you have the linebackers work a bunch of different ways to push guys off or do a bunch of different things. I think one of the major differences from last year, what we saw with the Donatel defense, is we asked linebackers to cover running backs in the flat a lot last year. If you remember, especially the Giants game, right? It was like Saquon gets the ball in the flat, and we always see Eric Kendricks or Jordan Hicks chasing him, not able to get him down. It's a 10-yard gain for the Giants, and they're just getting free money the whole time. One of the major aspects of this coverage is that when a running back goes fast to the flat or is a fast three, the linebackers make a push call, and then it's oftentimes the slot corner is responsible for taking that player, and the linebacker goes and covers whoever the slot player was short until he goes deep. So that push call and an under call, conversely, from the outside, is when a receiver runs like a drag route across the field underneath the offense. So that combination allows them to pass it off in a way that, you're not able to pass it off in man coverage. That gives you a little bit of advantage. I will say the Flores defense actually uses a lot of country cover three, which is the spot drop zone. But the reason they do it is because as a defense, you have a limited time to focus on certain things, right? You want to focus on critical areas, and the more you focus on an area when you're coaching, the better you'll be at that area. So the Flores defense is going to spend a ton of time on the split stuff. It's going to spend a ton of time on the different formations, and it's going to spend a ton of time on man coverage. It doesn't have as much time as Saban, who primarily bases out of the man match stuff, whether it's cover seven or the Rip Liz stuff, does on that, because Saban doesn't play as much man coverage. So the cover three is more of a mix up to the cover one, where it's like, okay, well, we're not just going to run cover one all the time, right? Because there are beaters for that. There are ways offenses can run to beat that. So we're going to try to keep you on your toes and run some cover three. And cover three has its uses. It's not like spot drop zone is completely useless and can't defend anything, but there are ways to beat it if you're running it consistently. So there's kind of a dichotomy there where Flores does have the rip blitz stuff in his toolbook. It's a small part of what he's doing as an offense, and a lot of what they're going to run in cover 3 is just going to be normal country cover 3, and they're going to drop into zones, but it's a mix-up from what they're doing. And maybe they get there a funky way, right? Say they have 7 guys on the line of scrimmage, but it's a bluff, and they drop back into cover 3. That's still going to confuse the offense and throw it off, and the quarterback might be late to recognize that it's a cover 3 zone. I mean, even under Zimmer, if you remember, and Harrison Smith did not do this a lot last year, when Harry would fly up and down the line of scrimmage, like just before the snap, that sort of stuff is what the Dolphins have done. Javon Holland was asked to be from a wide blitzer, from a blitzer like on the line of scrimmage, to being the deep safety, and he was able to do that. I think that's something Lewis Seen has a really intriguing skill set for, right? So that sort of stuff is what makes the cover 3 unique in the Flores defense, rather than necessarily a complex scheme of passing stuff off. So with cover 3 kind of gone over, we can go to cover 7. Cover 7 is man match quarters. I had to shout out Luke Braun. He's done a ton of great work on teaching man match quarters. If you go back to 2021 under Zimmer, 2021, it should be noted, we hired Carl Scott as defensive backs coach from Alabama, right? So that's a pretty clear indication of what we're doing. Obviously, with Flores coming in, he's got the ties to Nick Saban and that man match cover 7 stuff. The Dolphins ran a little bit of it. Again, they didn't do that much, but the general principles are there. There's also a clinic Carl Scott gave on man match on cover 7. If you just Google Carl Scott cover 7 clinic, it's a YouTube video. It's like an hour long. It's really detailed information on how that defense works. So I'm not going to go too deep into it right now, but you know, it's got a ton of good information and is explained by a coach better than I could explain it here on the podcast, because he's got diagrams and tape and all that sort of stuff. It's a lot better. So the final coverage that Flores runs, and they actually run it a fair bit, and it's coming back into prominence, I would say, in the NFL a little bit more.
Hey, if you don't know what this defense is, you must have stepped out of a time machine from 1996 or something.
Right,
It's been
because
a long time.
this defense dominated the NFL in the 2000s, and it's Tampa 2. And the reason Tampa 2 is valuable, and Tampa 2 is actually, the way it plays, is more like a middle of field closed cover 3 scheme than it is a true cover 2 scheme. And the reason that is the Mike linebacker, the middle linebacker, is what's known as the pole runner, and he has to take anything that goes vertical up the seam. So Eric Kendricks, in his time with the Vikings, was great with this, where he had the ability to cover Devontae Adams up the middle of the field, right? There are some good reps of him breaking up passes to Devontae Adams up the middle of the field in a Tampa 2 defense. So it allows that player to get depth. The way the Dolphins play it, they actually do a really good job of teaching it, where the Tampa side will play, the side the Tampa player is looking to will play at a different depth than the side they're not looking to kind of even out some of the issues that you have with the depths of the defense because of the way offenses attack that defense. So it's just a note that, again, it's a small portion of the coverage. The primary coverages are going to be that cover 1 look, and you're going to see a lot of cover 3 as well as a mix up to that cover 1 look. But the Tampa is a tool in the toolbox. And the difference is, you know, you've got 2 deep safeties who are able to widen out wider than they are in standard cover 2. That helps them with outside breaking routes like smash concepts, which are a cover 2 beater. When you have a corner squatting on an out route or on a curl route, you need the safety to be able to get over the top to take the corner route. Tampa 2 helps that safety be able to do that because they can play wider, because they have coverage up the middle, up the seam with that linebacker. So it helps kind of alleviate a couple of the weaknesses in cover 2 while also being kind of a safe coverage, right? And that's something that they'll use in the red zone quite a bit. It's something that they will use, you know, as a safer coverage when they're up trying to kill some time. So, I mean,
did we do it?
I think we did it. There's so much stuff that, you know, is minutia and detail that I wasn't quite able to get to
Oh, this was a
over
great.
everything here, but
Oh no.
a lot of that stuff is hopefully available in my articles. And if you guys have questions, hit me up on Twitter. I'll try to answer as detailed as I can on those. But yeah, that's basically it on the Flores defense. I mean, this was a lot of stuff together. I'm running ragged here a little bit on the voice, I think, at this point, but we're doing good.
You did great. That was really, really awesome, Matt. Great work, and thank you for putting this all together for us.
Yeah, excellent. It was my pleasure. I'm really excited to see this defense over the course of the season. I will say, the way the Vikings personnel is right now, I have concerns about our ability to run this at a high level, but I think honestly the floor is a lot higher than what we saw from the defense last year. You look at the Dolphins defense, which had good, not great personnel in its like they had atrocious personnel in their first year, right? Like it was a similar roster to what the Bears were putting out on defense last year, right? Which is just like we have absolutely no hope of playing this style of man coverage well. We just don't have the guys for it. I think the Vikings will be significantly better than that, especially with the pass rush arsenal that they have in terms of Hunter Smith and Davenport. Like I think that helps them quite a bit in that endeavor. But it might turn into a middle of the pack defense where we see progress. We get Flores' guys, we indoctrinated them into the system, and then they improve drastically in the second year in the system. So that's kind of what I hope for this defense. I don't think it's going to be, a top of the league defense catapulting us to a Super Bowl or something in year one, but I think it will provide us something to build off of in future years.
To that end, and I'll finish my thoughts with this, just that I do think that this Flores addition is a 2-year plan. I think that is the objective because I think it's going to take a little while for his situation to clear up. And I think this is kind of him taking a little, not a vacation, but just having something to do while he sorts all that out. His next head coaching job. And we're going to be all the luckier for it because I think it will build a foundation of some kind for the next era. So
Yeah.
pretty awesome.
Absolutely. Do you want to get us out of here, Greg?
Yeah, let me get this. Matt is flagging. He's like, man, wrap us up. You sure you don't want to do another 30 minutes? One of the extra pods? You and Nick.
Man, I might need some lozenges or something to get that done, man. I'm running low here.
Funny. Yes, absolutely. Matt, you can find on Twitter and send him questions. He loves to talk football at Fries Football on Twitter. You can find Nick Olson, who's not with us today, at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. He's back on Twitter, right?
Yeah, he's back. He lents over, so he's back.
Right.
Back and putting terrible memes into your feed, I'm sure. So.
And you can find me on Instagram at You've Been Greg. I might be changing that handle in the next month or two, but for now, that's where you can find me. You can find us at Kindred Skulls on Twitter. And we're available on all the places that you listen to your pods. If you have a place that you would like us to be, let us know. And it's been awesome being with you today on this beautiful spring day down here in Georgia. I don't know how things are in Philly, but
it's great. It's like 60s. It just hit 70, so we're doing really good here. It's been great weather so far this week. We had a great Easter.
We're ending with weather. That's the kind of energy level that we're going out on. I'm sorry, that was my fault. All right, awesome. I don't know, Matt. Should we end it with a digital hug? That feels right.
Let's go with the digital hug. I think I need it. I think Skull Vikings. Goodbye,
Vikings.
Guys.
Adios. Cool, baby.
The first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind. And we'll score the old Vikings along. We'll score